He divorced his wife, kicked both her and their child out of the house, then vanished for 10 long years. Not a single phone call, not a letter, just a few crumpled bills, and a short, cold apology. They called him a coward, a monster, a heartless man who abandoned his family. But the truth was nothing like what they saw. 10 years later, when his wife finally uncovered the secret he had buried in the shadows, her heart no longer had the strength to hate him. And sometimes, the moment you touch the truth, tears start falling and just won't stop. Thomas was never the kind of man the world would call great. He didn't drive a fancy car. He didn't know how to say romantic things. He had no grand ambitions. But he loved his wife and daughter with a quiet, unwavering love, a kind of love that didn't need fireworks. It just needed to exist like breathing. And when love is as quiet as breathing, people often don't see it until it's gone. At 30, the nightmare began. His family's company, where 3 generations had poured their pride and reputation, collapsed overnight after a real estate market crash. Thomas, though not part of the executive board, was dragged into a whirlpool of debt. Banks, partners, credit cards, even lawsuits loomed on the horizon. The tiny house where the 3 of them lived, it was co-signed under the family's name, and now it was just another asset waiting to be seized. Rachel, his wife, was only a preschool teacher. She knew nothing about finance. She only knew how to care for Emily, their 8-year-old daughter, who preferred a violin to dolls. In the chaos of his life, Thomas stood in the dark, watching the 2 of them sleep soundly under the soft streetlight filtering through the curtains. And in that moment, he knew. If he stayed, they'd all go under, but if he left, they might just have a chance to live. That night, he began drafting the divorce papers, silently. No tears, no goodbyes. Just a savings book on the kitchen table with a scribbled note for Emily's future. The divorce papers arrived on a Monday morning. Inside the envelope, there was nothing but a stack of legal documents and a small note hastily scribbled, "You deserve a better life. I'm sorry." No explanation, no reasons, not even a final meeting to say goodbye. Rachel went still. She held the paper in her hands until it crumpled, soaked in her tears. She called dozens of times, but it was useless. Thomas had vanished like he never existed. She screamed in despair. And in the heat of her anger, she told her daughter, "Your father chose to abandon us." Thomas heard those words through a public payphone miles away. He didn't reply. He simply watched her name flash on the screen, then disappear into silence. He had made his choice, and that choice had no room for weakness. He hired an old friend, a former accountant, to wire money to Rachel and Emily every month, using an anonymous sender name. Every tuition payment, every hospital visit, even Emily's music lessons, all paid in advance. Each transfer came with a simple message from a friend. As for Thomas, he began living like a ghost. He delivered packages during the day, washed dishes at night, slept in a damp, windowless room, and ate stale bread from the clearance rack. Every dollar he earned he poured into a family that no longer bore his name. Rachel never thought she'd have to start her life over. At the age of 30, when Thomas disappeared, she had no choice but to stand on her own 2 feet. By day, she taught preschool at a small suburban school. By night, she dove into MBA classes at a community college. There were nights she came home so late, she'd take off her shoes at the door, feet blistered and aching, too tired to even remember what she'd eaten for dinner. Emily, her daughter, slowly got used to doing homework in the corner of her mother's office. She'd heat up leftovers in an old microwave, keep herself busy while Rachel worked. There were days when Rachel couldn't afford a babysitter and didn't dare miss work. The anger in her grew like a shadow that followed her every step. It wasn't just pain, it became her fuel. She didn't cry for Thomas anymore. She hated him. She swore she'd never forgive him. But then, on a rainy March afternoon, a package arrived at their tiny apartment. Emily rushed to get it, eyes wide with excitement. Inside was an electric piano, a high-quality model carefully wrapped. Tucked in was a small note for the little girl who loves Chopin from a friend. Rachel froze. She had never told anyone that Emily loved Chopin since the age of 7, ever since she'd heard her father's old CD. Only Thomas knew that. Who sent the gift? A family friend, a teacher, or... Him Rachel watched as Emily ran her fingers over the keys, eyes sparkling like she was touching a dream. And for the first time, Rachel didn't feel just hatred. She felt a question rise inside her if he truly didn't care. How did he know? Thomas never truly left. He only stepped back far enough to not cause chaos, but close enough to intervene, if ever needed. In those early years, he still remembered Emily's birthday. He still knew her favorite color was lavender. He always picked piano music to play at night. Some things, no matter how hard you try, you just can't forget. In the spring, when Emily turned 10, she performed at her first children's recital at the District Cultural Center. Rachel rushed through the lobby, adjusting her daughter's dress, polishing her shoes, snapping a few photos before the stage lights came on. And Thomas, he stood behind a concrete pillar at the far end of the hallway, baseball cap pulled low, holding a ticket stub with a torn corner gripped tightly in his hand. He never entered the hall. He simply stood there, listening to Emily's piano drifting from the speakers, mixing with the wind and the footsteps of strangers passing by. When the crowd applauded, Thomas clapped too softly, just enough to hear it himself. He wasn't there to be seen. He was there to be near. Another time, mid-September, Rachel had texted a friend, saying she was called in for a night shift, and Emily would be home alone. Thomas knew. He bought a hot meal, Emily's favorite, packed it in a thermal container, and quietly left it at the apartment door. No knock, no message, just a paper bag and a small note. Eat while it's still warm. He left before anyone saw him. Sitting behind the wheel, he whispered to himself, "As long as I know they're okay. That's enough." Thomas lived like a shadow, not because he didn't want to be part of their lives, but because he believed his presence would bring more pain than peace. He chose silence. He chose distance. He chose to watch his daughter grow up through faint streaks of light in the crowd. And deep down, through all the ache, he kept telling himself, as long as they're smiling, even if I'm just a stranger, it's worth it. Emily was no longer the little girl hiding behind the stage curtain, hair in braids, white ballet flats on her feet. At 16, she was tall and slender. Her eyes always seemed to be thinking of something far beyond the room she stood in. The music she played wasn't innocent anymore. It held a strange kind of depth, like she was telling a story she'd never dared to put into words. She had just received news of her acceptance to the State Academy of the Arts, a place many students had to wait years just to dream about. Rachel hugged her daughter tight when the acceptance email came in, but inside she felt something rising, a mix of pride, fear, and something she couldn't quite name. That academy. It wasn't free, but then just like before, a bank transfer came through. The entire first year's tuition paid in full. Sender anonymous. Message: a friend of your father. Emily held the statement in her hands for a long time. Then she looked up at her mother. Mom. Did Dad really leave us? It wasn't a new question. She had asked it as a child, when other kids had their fathers pick them up from school, when she made Father's Day cards and didn't know where to send them. But now, the question came slower. Softer, like the way she played piano at sunset. Rachel didn't answer. Every year that passed, the words your father chose to leave echoed in her mind, with less certainty. The first crack came when Emily got that piano. Then again, when every hospital bill, every music course, every school payment was never late. Not even once. And now, her daughter stood holding the dream of her life, made possible by someone who never showed their face. "I just want to know why he left," Emily said gently. No blame in her voice, just sadness. If he didn't care, then who's this person who keeps signing as a friend of Dad? Rachel turned away, eyes red and wet. For years, she had worn her anger like armor. But as Emily grew, playing music with eyes that searched for someone who never showed up, the anger started to crack. In its place came a hollow pain, the kind that comes when you can't give your child a simple, clear answer. And what hurt Rachel most was the realization that she no longer wanted to keep saying he was a villain. Because somewhere deep inside her, she too was beginning to wonder if he truly didn't care. Why did he love Emily so clearly, so quietly, and so well? Late in winter, the wind sliced through narrow streets like sharpened blades. Rachel had just gotten off work. Her thin coat offered little warmth. She stopped by the small convenience store she knew well, picked up a carton of warm milk and a few rolls for a late dinner. The streetlights were already glowing, casting long shadows of people rushing home onto the dusty pavement. As she stepped outside, arms full of groceries, she bumped into a man hurrying past. A light thud. A soft, "Sorry," and then a baseball cap hit the ground. Rachel bent down, reaching to help. But when she looked up, her hand froze in midair. Thomas, his eyes still the same eyes, only now rimmed with exhaustion. Sunken. Red. His beard was uneven, his skin sun-darkened and rough. His clothes were faded, and the delivery bag slumped heavy on his back. He looked 20 years older. In a single blink, Rachel couldn't move. Years of silence rushed back with the wind and hit her like a storm. The milk carton slipped from her hand, rolling across the sidewalk. "It's you," she whispered, not sure if her voice held surprise, anger, or pain. Thomas stepped back half a pace. His eyes flickered. "Rachel." She stepped forward. No thought, no hesitation. And then, smack. Her hand landed clean across his cheek, not hard, but firm. Not to hurt him, but because there was no other way to let the years of abandonment speak. "You left me," she said, breath shaky. "Do you even know what I went through? There were nights I had nothing left in my wallet, and I still had to smile at our daughter and tell her everything would be okay." Thomas didn't flinch. He stood still, head lowered, as if even he didn't dare look up. Rachel's voice cracked. Tears welled, but she didn't stop. "Do you know how many times Emily asked about you Father's Day, her birthdays, her first concert?" She sat waiting for someone who never showed up. "She asked me, 'Mom, does Dad not love us anymore?'" Her voice broke on that last line, each word cutting into her own chest. Thomas still didn't move, but for a second, his eyes shimmered red. He set the delivery bag down gently, his voice hoarse, rough as gravel. "Didn't know how else to do it. I just wanted you and Emily to have a chance. Back then, I had nothing left. Debt, lawsuits. My parents lost everything. I thought, if I disappeared, you'd be free to start again." Rachel shook her head, laughed through tears. "A chance you think people can just start over after being left, like that you think I needed your money, or a ghost hiding backstage." Thomas couldn't answer. He twisted the cap in his hands, voice barely above a whisper. "I never expected forgiveness. I just wanted to know you two were okay. Every month knowing she could smile, knowing she was learning music. It made me feel like I still had a purpose, even from a distance." Rachel covered her face with both hands. Years of hatred, now shaken by a single weary voice. When she looked up, Thomas was already walking away. his frail shoulders disappearing into the crowd. No goodbye. No turning back. Just like the day he left, except this time. She saw clearly. His eyes, too, were filled with tears. 3 days after that brief encounter on the sidewalk, Rachel still couldn't sleep. The images kept replaying in her mind. Thomas's sunken face. His shoulders slumped, as if carrying the weight of the world, and that last sentence echoing like a ghost. "I just wanted you and our daughter to live." She had once believed she knew that man, the husband who'd stayed up all night when Emily had a fever, who packed her lunchbox every morning just because she hated takeout. But now, she realized she didn't know him at all. Not why he left. Not how he'd lived since. Rachel contacted an old acquaintance in legal services to investigate the financial records tied to her and Emily over the past 10 years. Part of her needed answers. The rest was for Emily. The girl who had always asked if Dad didn't love us. Then why does someone still sign a friend of Dad? 3 days later, the report arrived. Thick. Heavy. She didn't need to read every page. A glance was enough to make her hands tremble. The person who had been paying Emily's tuition. For a decade, it was the same account. Every transfer signed with the initials TMC. The receipt for the electric piano. The repair costs after every storm. Private tutoring fees. Even those exact bakery orders for Emily's favorite bread. All came from the same vendor. The sender always left the same instruction. No receipt, no name. But what stopped Rachel cold was a thin set of medical documents tucked at the end. Thomas had been diagnosed with early-stage heart failure 2 years ago, condition worsening from overwork and chronic insomnia. The doctor's notes were clear, recommended full rest. Avoid all strenuous labor. Rachel read that line and folded over. He wasn't a coward, and he wasn't heartless. He was just a man trying to be useful from the shadows so that she and her daughter could live in the light. She whispered into the stillness, as if speaking to a ghost. "Why didn't you say anything? Why did you carry this alone? For so long, why didn't you let me carry it with you?" She clutched the file to her chest, like it was her own heart cracked again. Because sometimes, the deepest pain doesn't come from being left behind. It comes from realizing the person you've hated for years was only ever trying to save you, in the most desperate way he knew how. That morning the sky was gray, like a still lake with no ripples. Rachel gripped the steering wheel, her heart hollow. Emily sat beside her, clutching the file folder, its corners creased and worn. They didn't speak the entire ride, each lost in her own trail of thoughts. But both heading to the same destination, the freight station in the industrial district south of the city. According to a note in the financial records, it was where Thomas used to work as a laborer years ago. They weren't sure he was still there, but it was the only lead they had. At the dispatch office, a middle-aged worker squinted at the old photo Rachel handed over, then gave a small nod. "Oh, Tom. Skinny guy. Old gray cap. He still swings by around this time late morning, but he doesn't work here anymore. Switched to deliveries. Sometimes drops off bread for the strays behind the containers." Rachel thanked him, then led Emily across the yard to where a stack of old freight cars sat rusting amidst weeds and rows of dented containers. They turned a corner and froze. Thomas was crouched down, setting a large loaf of bread into a cardboard box. A small, scruffy dog peeked out from behind a trash bin, tail wagging cautiously. He hadn't seen them. The wind tousled his hair. His jacket was frayed at the shoulders, shoes caked in dried mud. But his figure, Emily knew it instantly. "That's Dad," she whispered. Thomas stood up and turned, his eyes locked with Rachel's, and in that split second, There was surprise. There was fear. But also a kind of longing, like someone who'd been waiting a lifetime to be seen. Thomas froze. In his hand, he still held half a loaf of bread, never got the chance to set it down. A late morning breeze blew past, tilting his worn baseball cap sideways. But he didn't move. His eyes stayed locked on the two figures walking toward him. A woman, her face older, stronger, but her eyes still held the look he once knew. And beside her, a young girl, hair tied low, clutching a faded, wrinkled photo in her hand. Rachel said nothing. She just looked. The wind swept across her thin jacket, carrying with it years of anger, sleepless nights, and hundreds of unanswered questions. Emily stepped forward first. The 16-year-old stopped right in front of her father, looked up. Her voice was small but steady. "I know you never really left. I've always known." Thomas swallowed hard. His lips trembled as if he was about to speak, then didn't. Finally, he whispered, his voice like wind brushing through leaves. "I'm sorry for not being there, but I never left your hearts. Not for a single day." Emily raised her arms, not in a sudden rush, but slowly, deliberately. The embrace of a child who grew up with an empty space inside, now finding her way back to where she belonged all along. Thomas held her close. His rough hands pressed gently against the back of her school uniform, as if afraid the moment would disappear. Rachel stepped forward, slowly, carefully. She didn't say, "I forgive you." She didn't ask why. Now she simply moved closer, and after a quiet pause, rested her head on his shoulder. Just like she used to in that old kitchen when he did the dishes, and she stood behind him looking for a little peace. 5 seconds, just 5 seconds. Not long, but enough to begin again. Not from the start, but from the place where they once paused, yet never truly left. Thomas didn't move back in with Rachel. They didn't remarry. They didn't rebuild the family in the traditional sense. But one spring, not long after, he settled into a small wooden house just across a narrow alley and a low fence from hers. It was an old place. The roof had been patched with tin sheets. Out back, there was just enough yard for a few rows of vegetables and a small dog. The same stray he used to feed behind the freight yard. Emily still called him Dad, without hesitation, without awkwardness. Every Friday afternoon, she'd stop by with her electric piano and a few new pieces of music. They didn't need many words. Just notes on a keyboard and the kind of look that only comes from knowing someone too well. Rachel remained independent. She ran a small educational consulting office, busy, composed, much like the woman she had grown into. But every evening, around 7 p.m., a bowl of hot soup would quietly appear on Thomas's doorstep. Sometimes it was mustard greens. Sometimes the beef stew he used to love. No note, no message, just something that never stopped. They didn't talk about the past. They didn't promise the future. But from the moment they found each other again, they never left each other again. Rachel once wrote a letter she never sent. It read, "Real love isn't about holding on. It's about stepping back so the one you love can fully live, and then returning at just the right time so no one has to live with regret."